restless spoilers. Sharon's return to Nick's house should have been nothing more than a quiet reset, the kind of ordinary step that feels almost healing after weeks of tension and uncertainty. But the air inside the home was wrong the second she crossed the threshold. It was not simply silence. It was the feeling of something held to still, like a room that had been waiting for a mistake. Sharon moved through the hallway with the cautious instinct of someone who has learned, through experience, that danger in Genoa City rarely announces itself. The bedroom door was not fully closed, and the faintest shift of shadow inside the room made her stomach tighten. When she stepped in, the scene hit her with a kind of disbelief that turns into dread in the same breath. Sienna was there not as a guest, not as someone who had wandered into the wrong place, but as an intruder in the most intimate part of the home, rifling through space that did not belong to her. Sharon's horror wasn't only about the break-in, it was about what it implied. Someone doesn't choose a bedroom by accident. Someone doesn't cross that boundary unless they are searching for something specific or preparing to do something irreversible. The confrontation ignited instantly, two women locked in a collision of fear and fury, Sharon driven by protective instinct and moral outrage, Sienna driven by the frantic, cornered energy of someone who had convinced herself she had no other option. The distance between them felt smaller than it should have been, like the walls themselves were narrowing, forcing the moment toward violence even before either of them fully understood how it had escalated. Sharon tried to stop her, tried to hold her there long enough for the truth to come spilling out. But Sienna's panic was not the kind that dissolves into tears. It was the kind that becomes dangerous because it is desperate to end the threat immediately. In the struggle, the glint of a blade flashed like a sudden, sickening punctuation mark. Sienna, trembling and frantic, swung the knife without precision, without strategy, only with the blind terror of someone who believes the next second might ruin her life forever. The impact was immediate and devastating. Sharon's body jolted as if the world had shifted under her feet, her breath catching in a way that made the room tilt. She staggered, the shock registering in fragments, not fully believing what had happened until warmth spread and weakness surged through her legs. Sienna froze for a heartbeat, staring at what she'd done. And in that pause there was something terrifyingly human, pure horror, pure realization more survival instincts took over. She fled, not because she was calm enough to plan, but because staying meant being caught, and being caught meant everything she had been running from would finally swallow her whole. When Nick and Noah returned, they walked into the aftermath without warning, the kind of scene that changes the shape of a family in a single second. Sharon lay unmoving, and for an instant the mind refuses to interpret what the eyes are seeing, as if denial might physically rewind time. Then reality slammed in with brutal clarity. Nick's desperation detonated into raw panic, his hands uselessly searching for help, for pressure, for any way to stop what was happening. Noah's shock cut deeper because it was not just fear. It was recognition that something evil had entered their life and left Sharon broken in its wake. They called for emergency help with voices that barely sounded like their own, the entire house suddenly reduced to a single frantic mission: keep her here, keep her breathing, keep this from becoming final. But Sharon's body was already slipping past the point where hope could easily pull her back. Her last moments were not theatrical, they were cruel in their quietness. The kind of fading that feels almost unreal because it happens while the people who love you are still screaming into the air for the universe to correct itself. By the time help arrived, the damage had become irreversible. Sharon's life drained away in front of Nick and Noah, and the helplessness of that moment branded itself into them. The kind of trauma that never fully leaves because it isn't only grief, it's the memory of watching time run out while the world refuses to stop. In the immediate aftermath, shock turned into a numb, vicious clarity. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random violence. Someone came into that house with intent, and Sharon paid the price. The grief was immediate, but so was the burning need to understand why, because grief without answers becomes something more corrosive, something that eats away at everything else until it either finds meaning or turns into obsession. The police investigation that followed did not treat the scene as a simple tragedy, because the details did not support a spontaneous encounter. They cataloged the disturbed space, the signs of entry, the specific way the bedroom had been targeted. Everything about the intrusion suggested purpose. The angle of movement, the hurried searching, the unfamiliar traces that didn't match the household's normal patterns. It pointed to someone who came prepared, someone who expected to be there, someone who believed they had time to locate something or complete a task. That distinction mattered because it transformed Sharon's death from a horrifying consequence of bad timing into the likely result of a plan set in motion long before Sharon walked through that door. As the scene was processed with painstaking care, another detail emerged small enough to be overlooked by anyone not trained to look for meaning in fragments. A tiny storage device, concealed and out of place, surfaced during the examination, its presence immediately suspicious because it didn't belong there by coincidence. It was the kind of object people hide when they are afraid of what's on it, when they want information to survive even if they don't. Its discovery changed the case from a violent break-in to something more complex, a message, a trail, a link to motive. Once the contents were accessed and the coded material was identified, the investigation pivoted sharply into darker territory. The messages weren't casual. They weren't vague. They were deliberate communications, encrypted to conceal intent, and their origin traced back to Matt Clark. That name, attached to the threads of this tragedy, carried a particular weight because it suggested orchestration rather than impulse, coercion rather than random violence. When the code was cracked and the message revealed, it exposed the true horror behind Sienna's presence in Nick's home. She wasn't merely trespassing, and she wasn't simply acting out of personal instability. She had been pushed. She had been threatened. Matt's message made the stakes brutally clear: harm to Noah, exposure of Sienna's darkest secret, consequences that would detonate her life unless she carried out a specific directive. Sharon was not collateral. Sharon was the target. And in that revelation, the tragedy widened because it meant Sharon didn't die just because Sienna panicked. Sharon died because someone decided she needed to be removed, and then found a vulnerable person to do the dirty work. That discovery turns Sharon into more than a victim of a break-in. It turns her into the center of a power play, a human cost in someone else's war. And it forces Nick and Noah to confront the possibility that the most dangerous enemy isn't the woman who fled in panic, but the man who pulled her strings from the shadows. Now Sienna is on the run, and the question isn't simply where she will go, but what kind of person she becomes in the days that follow. Because running doesn't erase what she did, it only decides what happens next. Her escape is fueled by terror, but terror splits people into two types: those who keep running until they are caught, and those who eventually turn back because the weight becomes unbearable. The discovery of the storage device and Matt's coercive messages changes the moral geometry of the story, but it does not erase the blood on Sienna's hands. She may have been threatened, manipulated, and forced toward a mission she didn't fully control, yet Sharon still died during a struggle that began with Sienna choosing to enter that home. The pressure now is absolute. If Sienna stays silent, she becomes the villain in the simplest version of the story, the intruder who stabbed Sharon and fled. Victor-like forces in Genoa City thrive on simple narratives because simple narratives are easy to weaponize, easy to spin, easy to use as leverage. But if Sienna confesses, she risks triggering the very consequences Matt promised. And she risks being crushed by legal reality because confessions do not always arrive with mercy attached. The only thing that could shift the balance is the truth of coercion, yet even that truth demands courage because telling it means naming Matt publicly, admitting her own vulnerability, and exposing the secret Matt used as a chokehold. In other words, confession is not just a moral act. It is a declaration of war against the person who controlled her. And running is not just fear. It is also a grim calculation that silence might keep Noah safe, at least for a while, even if it destroys her. That is the cruelty of Matt's design. He didn't just order an action. He constructed a trap where every path punishes Sienna, where even choosing honesty could ignite retaliation. The most frightening part is that Sharon's death has now created momentum that Sienna cannot stop. The police will hunt her because the evidence at the scene points to a deliberate break-in and a fleeing suspect. Nick and Noah will be pulled into a grief so violent it will demand a target, and Sienna's absence makes her the obvious one. And Matt, seeing the walls closing in, will not relax because a coercive mastermind never assumes a pawn will stay obedient once blood has been spilled. He assumes the pawn might break, might talk, might collapse under guilt. So Sienna's next move becomes the hinge of everything. If she chooses confession, she gambles on truth being stronger than fear, on the idea that exposing Matt's threats can redirect the narrative away from her as a lone monster and toward the larger machinery that pushed her there. If she chooses silence, she becomes exactly what Matt needs her to be, the scapegoat who carries the blame, while he remains untouched, free to shift his attention to Noah and finish controlling the story from a distance. And that is why the question hanging over Genoa City is so sharp, so urgent, and so terrifyingly personal. Will Sienna keep running until the guilt hollows her out and Matt's grip tightens again? Or will she turn back and confess, knowing that the truth might save Noah from Matt's threats, but destroy her own life in the process? Either way, Sharon's death has done what tragedy in Genoa City always does. It has cracked open a deeper conspiracy, exposed the most vulnerable pressure points of the people left behind, and ensured that what comes next will not be about healing, but about survival, accountability, and the ruthless fight over who controls the truth. In the hours after Sharon's death, Genoa City stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a mechanism that had been jolted, reoriented, and set into motion with a single violent act. Grief did not arrive gently for Nick and Noah. It arrived like a physical force, collapsing the logic of their day-to-day lives into one repeating image they could not escape: Sharon on the floor. The blood, the frantic hands that could not fix what was already breaking, the terrible certainty that their voices calling for help were not powerful enough to bargain with time. The house that had once held routine and warmth became a sealed container of evidence and memory, each room echoing with the cruelty of how quickly safety can be rewritten into tragedy. Nick's anguish hardened almost immediately into something sharper because his mind could not tolerate the helplessness. It needed direction, a target, a reason that was more than it happened. Noah's devastation carried a different poison, because he could sense the invisible thread pulling through the adventurer had not simply been caught in the wrong moment. She had collided with something aimed at him, something calculated, something that now made his own existence feel like a threat to the people he loved. That feeling is a uniquely unbearable kind of guilt, the kind that doesn't care about logic, the kind that grows even when everyone tells you it isn't your fault. Because deep down you still hear the same question over and over. If you weren't in the crosshairs, would she still be alive? As the investigation deepened, the tone shifted from shock to precision. The police were not looking at a chaotic accident. They were looking at a scene with intention stamped into its smallest details. The signs of entry, the targeted location, the disturbed space of everything suggested someone came to Nick's house with a purpose. The discovery of the small storage device confirmed that the break-in belonged to a larger plan, because people do not leave behind encrypted messages by coincidence. Not unless they are either careless in panic or desperate enough to plant a truth they know might otherwise die with them. When the messages were decrypted and Matt Clark's involvement surfaced, the case cracked open into a far darker shape: coercion, manipulation, leverage designed to force action. That information didn't soften Sharon's loss. It intensified it, because it meant Sharon's death wasn't a random eruption of violence. It was the consequence of someone deciding she needed to be handled. It also reframed Sienna from a solitary villain into a dangerous variable inside someone else's strategy. But the law and public perception rarely have patience for nuance when blood has been spilled. For the city, the story was already forming into something clean and digestible. An intruder stabbed Sharon and ran. For Nick and Noah, the story became more personal and more terrifying. Sharon was taken from them because a man like Matt could reach into their home through a frightened, unstable pawn and turn private life into a battlefield. Sienna, meanwhile, ran with the kind of panic that doesn't fade once you're out of sight, because the real horror isn't being seen, it's remembering what you did when no one is looking. She did not become calm after she escaped. She became frantic in a quieter way, driven by the desperate need to outpace consequences that felt like they were already inches behind her. Every siren in the distance sounded like a verdict. Every passing car felt like pursuit. The knife, the struggle, Sharon's Calypsethos images played on repeat inside her skull with brutal clarity, because trauma is not kind enough to blur itself when you need it to. She clung to the idea that she had not meant to kill, that it had happened in panic, that she had been trapped into this by threats she could not outmaneuver. But each rationalization shattered against the same unchangeable truth. Sharon was dead, and Sienna was the last person standing over her. The guilt did not arrive as a moral lesson. It arrived as a suffocating weight that made even breathing feel like theft. She moved from place to place like a shadow, hiding not only from police and cameras, but from the version of herself she could no longer deny. What made her terror worse was that Matt's power did not vanish just because she ran. It sharpened. Coercion like his is built to survive exactly this moment the pawn panics. The moment the plan goes wrong, the moment the threat of exposure grows. Matt would anticipate flight, he would anticipate guilt. He would anticipate the possibility that Sienna might choose confession as an escape route. And because he anticipates it, he can weaponize it. The messages he had already sent were not merely instructions, they were hooks sunk deep into her fear. He had threatened Noah, threatened exposure of her darkest secret, promised consequences that were designed to feel worse than prison, worse than disgrace, worse than death. Now that Sharon was gone, those threats became even more potent, because Sienna's silence was no longer just self-preservation, it became a twisted form of protection for Noah, at least in her mind. If she confessed and named Matt, would she ignite his retaliation? Would she push him into actually harming Noah instead of merely threatening it? Would she turn Noah into a living consequence of her attempt to save herself? That is the trap that makes confession feel like betrayal and silence feel like duty, even when silence is poisoning her from the inside. Nick and Noah were dragged through the first stages of mourning while being forced to absorb the evolving reality of the investigation, and that combination turned their grief into something volatile. Nick's pain became a storm that needed somewhere to land, and Sienna's name gave it direction, especially because Sienna's disappearance looked like guilt to the world. Noah's reaction was more complicated, because every new detail about Matt's coercion tightened the sense that the disaster was orbiting him. Even if Noah wasn't responsible, he was the axis around which the threat had been constructed, and that knowledge is corrosive. It made him feel exposed, as if any part of his life could be invaded and weaponized again. Sharon's death, instead of closing the chapter on danger, opened it wider because it proved that the people who cared about him could be targeted simply for being near him. That fear changes a person. It narrows their choices. It makes trust feel like a luxury and normal life feel like a lie. As word spread that the encrypted messages linked Matt to Sienna, the atmosphere in Genoa City turned predatory. People who had barely known Sharon's warmth spoke her name like a headline. People who had never looked twice at Sienna now felt entitled to define her as a monster. That public hunger for a simple villain created pressure on the investigation, because the community's emotional need for closure often masquerades as justice. The police, however, could not ignore what the evidence suggested. Sienna had not entered the house on a whim, and Matt's communications indicated purposeful coercion. That did not absolve Sienna, but it expanded the scope. Now there was not only a fugitive to locate, but also a manipulator to unmask, and manipulators rarely sit still once they sense light turning toward them. In a story like this, the most dangerous moments do not happen when the crime is committed. They happen afterward, when the architect begins cleaning the edges, tightening their narrative, removing liabilities. Sienna's next choice began to crystallize not because she suddenly became brave, but because the weight of living as a ghost started to feel like a different kind of death. Her fear of Matt and fear of prison collided with her horror at Sharon's loss, And that collision created a desperate longing for an end to running, an end to the messages, an end to waking up with Sharon's face in her mind and realizing she had no way to undo the damage. Confession started to feel less like surrender and more like the only remaining path that contained any shred of meaning. Yet even as that thought formed, it was immediately threatened by the one thing Matt had always understood about her. She could endure almost anything if she believed enduring it would protect Noah. If Matt's hold was built on fear for Noah, then every step toward confession would feel like pushing Noah closer to the edge of a blade she could not see. That is why Sienna's internal battle became so brutal, because it was not a clean moral fork between truth and lies. It was a choice between two forms of catastrophe. If she confessed, she might expose Matt's coercion, give the police a clearer map to the larger threat, and stop being the only villain in the story. But she might also trigger retaliation and become the spark that burns Noah. If she stayed silent, she might keep Matt calmer for longer, delay his wrath, and preserve Noah's immediate safety. But she would also be allowing Matt to remain in control, to keep shaping events, to keep threatening, to keep using Noah as leverage against anyone else who might try to resist. Silence would not protect Noah permanently. It would merely extend Matt's power over him. And perhaps that was the turning point Sienna could no longer ignore. As long as Matt stayed hidden, Noah would never be safe anyway. The threat would not disappear. It would evolve. It would come back in another form. It would strike again, maybe not in a bedroom this time, maybe not with a knife, but with something equally final. Nick's grief, Noah's guilt, the police pressure, and Matt's shadow all tightened around the same truth. Sharon's death had created a crisis that could not be solved by one arrest. It demanded a reckoning with the system of intimidation that made it possible in the first place. If Sienna remained a ghost, the city would still get its villain eventually, but Matt might stay untouchable, free to rewrite the narrative and choose his next target. If Sienna surfaced and spoke, she would detonate her own life, but she might also fracture Matt's hold and expose the deeper machinery behind Sharon's murder. The question that now haunted every corner of this story wasn't only whether Sienna would confess. It was whether she could do it before Matt turned his threats into action, before Noah became the next casualty, before the truth was twisted so thoroughly that it could never be trusted even if it finally emerged. And as Sienna moved through the night with Sharon's death on her conscience and Matt's voice still echoing in her fear, the most terrifying realization settled in. Running had not kept her safe. It had only postponed the moment when she would have to decide what kind of person she was going to be after what she had done to me, and who stays silent and becomes exactly what Matt designed. Or someone who breaks the chain, even if breaking it destroys her.